So good afternoon. Good afternoon here in Geneva. Good morning, good day from wherever you join us online. Thank you for dialing in to this side event, to the 47th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, devoted to peaceful protests, in particular the use of force by states in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the Geneva Human Rights Platform, we are happy to be organizing this event jointly with Costa Rica and Switzerland, and I look forward to our discussions. Please note that this event is public, and it means it is being recorded. And as we are in a Zoom meeting, I do encourage you all to switch on your cameras all throughout the meeting so we can see each other in this virtual room. But do please mute your microphones until you take the floor in the discussion. For any technical questions, please contact directly the IT moderator in a bilateral chat, not to put that all in the main chat. I will soon be handing over to Ambassador Jörg Lauber from Switzerland, who will make the opening remarks, and then Her Excellency Catalina de Vandas Aguilar from Costa Rica will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussions. Throughout the event today, you will get to hear from a panel of 3 distinguished panelists and then have time for an interactive discussion, question and answer session. So please also already, while the colleagues give their presentations, do use the chat to send in your comments and questions. We will be taking stock of them. And in the first part of the event, we have that panel discussion. And in the second part, then we will bring those questions over to the moderator to continue the dialogue with our distinguished speakers. Also to say that if you want to take the floor yourselves, please do raise your electronic hand and we'll put you on a speakers list. We'll have 1 or 2 rounds of question and discussion, time allowing, and so you're also able additionally to the chat to pose your questions personally. With this, I would like to hand over directly to Ambassador Lauber for the opening remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you very much to you and the team of the Geneva Academy for your assistance in the organization of this side event, and to all of you who tuned in for taking time of your busy schedules. I know it's everybody's running, it's the Human Rights Council session, summer break is ahead, so everything has absolutely to be done before the summer break. So really, thank you very much. The issue we're discussing this afternoon is actually very dear to me. As you probably know, that Switzerland launched the initiative on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests 10 years ago. I remember it well because my colleague Barbara Fontana and I were here in Geneva at the time when we submitted the declaration that preceded the resolution. So that's why I'm still extremely interested in the issue. Since then, a lot of things happened. Together with Costa Rica, we have developed the resolution so as to address contemporary challenges linked to the protection of human rights before, during and after peaceful protests. I like to say that the importance of this initiative is truly universal. It was back then, 10 years ago, it was launched in the context of what we then called the Arab Spring. But even then, it took a thematic approach. We didn't talk about a specific region. We really wanted to look at the issue. And we all know that peaceful protests do in fact happen everywhere around the world, and that states respond to such protests in very, very different ways. I also like to say, I like to think that our initiative has remained focused on the obligations of states. It's stating the obvious, but states are the ones that have the responsibility in all circumstances, including in the context of peaceful protests, to promote, respect, and protect human rights and to prevent human rights violations. At the same time, it is preoccupying that there are continued reports of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, of arbitrary arrests and detention, of enforced disappearances, torture, sexual violence, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment taking place in the context of peaceful protests. States also increasingly resort to abusive criminal and civil proceedings or threats of such acts. Such threats or such practice stifles civic space, and it discourages individuals and groups from expressing their grievances and aspirations through peaceful protests. We also observe a general lack of accountability for human rights violations committed by state authorities during peaceful protests. This is despite the clear obligation of states to investigate effectively, impartially, and in a timely manner any allegation of unlawful use of force by law enforcement officials. Over the years, the resolution has addressed a wide range of specific issues. It outlined principles for the proper management of assemblies. It focused on less lethal weapons. It zoomed in on the use of new technologies related to organizing, sharing information, and increased surveillance. The main challenge that we identified from the beginning still remains: the excessive use of force by law enforcement officials. In some contexts, this is due to lack of appropriate domestic laws, procedures, and practices that are not in line with international law. In some, it is due to lack of proper training, including in applicable principles of law enforcement, such as necessity and proportionality. And in some contexts, the use of force is exercised deliberately and indiscriminately. International standards on the use of force of lethal weapons are clear. Nothing can ever justify the indiscriminate use of lethal force against a crowd. Over the years, through the Human Rights Council resolutions, but also through parallel initiatives, a lot of reports and guidance have been published by the High Commissioner's Office, special procedures of the Human Rights Council, and civil society. We will hear about them later today. The Human Rights Committee has also written its latest general comment on Article 21 of ICCPR, bringing the interpretation of this crucial article up to date. This is a particularly valuable legacy from the late Christoph Heyns. Today's side event will focus on peaceful protests in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 hasn't stopped people from taking to the streets to express their legitimate claims for justice and equality. We look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists about related concerns and trends. I trust that they will contribute to guiding our reflections around the future orientation of our Human Rights Council resolution. I'm afraid that social, economic, and cultural impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic will lead to more, not less, protests in the future. There are ample reasons to keep this important topic on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. And if I may speak on behalf of both Catalina, Costa Rica, and Switzerland, will present a new resolution at the June 22 session. Thank you very much, Felix. Again, thanks everybody for giving me the opportunity to say a few words introducing this event, and I wish you all an exciting exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lauber, for your initial remarks. That helps us to frame the discussion of today. I think that framing how we are exercising and globally the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, the freedom of expression and participation, and the conduct of public affairs, including, of course, the right of peaceful protest, and now how the COVID pandemic is impacting on those rights. Is important to analyze how states are responding to the exercise of peaceful protest in the context of the COVID. And for that is that we have organized the panel today, and I'm very pleased to have a very distinguished set of panelists here. I will start by introducing our first panelist. Our first panelist is Monsieur Clement Volu. He is currently the Special Rapporteur on the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and association of the Human Rights Council. And Clement, you took functions in April 2018. and have just had your interactive dialogue on your latest report on access to justice, in which you provided guidance on the issue on internet shutdowns. So I think that you were quite well prepared to address this conversation today. And so please, Clement, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Devant. I would like to thank the organizer and co-sponsor of these events, the Swiss Foreign Ministry, the Geneva Human Rights Platform, the Geneva Academy, and the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica for inviting me for this important event. The increased trends of criminalization and repression of peaceful protests has been a concern of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association since its establishment in 2010. Unfortunately, these trends have not been reversed. On the contrary, it has been on the rise, and COVID-19 pandemic has created an opportunity for some states to abuse emergency power and increase the crackdown on peaceful protests. Instead of listening and responding to people's need and expanding the ability of civil society to contribute to addressing this global challenge. However, many governments around the world have chosen to silence independent voices and increase their own power. As I mentioned last week during the presentation of my report to the Human Rights Council, many states have opted to respond to the many crises brought by the pandemic with a militaristic and security-based approach, with a focus on cementing control and crackdown on dissent and minority groups, rather than ensuring public health. The reality is that, as we fear, the pandemic has been used in many states as a pretext to infringe on fundamental freedoms. What are some ways that my mandate witnessed the way that the use of force have been manifest? I would like to highlight a couple of general trends I have been observing regarding the excessive use of force during the pandemic. We have seen a trend towards the militarization of crisis management, which is similarly worrying. Excessive and illegal use of force to enforce restriction to physical gathering that have led to killing and mass arrests of protests. We continue to see lethal weapons being used by law enforcement during peaceful protests. We are seeing, however, a rise of informal or private armed groups working together with police to harm and intimidate peaceful protests. Less lethal weapons continue to be indiscriminate use against protesters causing injuries. But we are also documenting the intentional use of less lethal weapons to harm protesters. For example, gas canister shoots or the body, rubber bullets shoots at the face, etc. We continue to document cases of sexual violence, including rape, against women demonstrators. This has been accompanied by a rise in harassment and attacks against gender equality and women's march by counter-protesters. There is a persistent lack of accountability and impunity for those police officers who committed these abuses. These practices are rooted in negative widespread perception that peaceful assemblies are a political threat or at best a nuisance to be managed. But in reality, peaceful assembly is a fundamental right, one of the most important we possess. Its exercise is a sign of a democratic and healthy society where individuals can shape their own future, where individuals can take part in the conduct of public affairs and decide for themselves. This negative image that stigmatizes protesters, dissent, and those who organize assembly to demand something has to change. How my mandate responds to this excessive use of force, but also general restriction during this COVID time, In response to this global misuse of COVID-19 response to restrict public freedom, I expressed my concern in April 2020 and launched a set of 10 guiding principles that provide recommendations to states and other key stakeholders to ensure their response to COVID-19 pandemic do not infringe upon the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The guidelines are based on the premises that the effectiveness of measures to defeat the COVID-19 outbreak depends on the ability of governments to secure people participation and trust. The second principle requires states to ensure that public health emergency is not used as a pretext for rights infringement. The crisis is no justification for excessive force to be used when dispersing assembly, nor for disproportionate penalty to be imposed. States have an obligation to inform the Secretary General of the United Nations if and when a state of emergency has been declared and of any resulting derogation of rights, which must themselves be in compliance with the Siracusa principle. The General Comment 37, which was adopted by the Human Rights Committee under the leadership of our much appreciated late colleague, Christoph Heinz, is also a great new tool in this regard. The paragraph 79 deals with excessive use of force. Specifically, it highlights that domestic law must not grant officials largely unrestricted power, for example, to use force or all necessary force to disperse assembly, or simply to shoot for the leg. In particular, domestic law must not allow use of force against participants in assembly or a warrant on excessive or discriminatory basis. The resolution 4420, adopted by the Human Rights Council in July 2020 under the leadership of Switzerland, gave another opportunity for the mandate to look at the use of force during peaceful protests, not only during COVID-19 crisis, but other types of crises that we can foresee, such as climate crisis, economic crisis after COVID-19, and other types of crises that the world can witness. I want to stop here and hope that we will, during our conversation, we will come on some of the specific issues and challenge and how to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clement, for your words and for framing what are the challenges that we're witnessing from the exercise of your mandate on the exercise of the right to freedom of association, of expression, and of course, peaceful protest. I would like now to give the floor to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Mr. Neil Corney. Neil Corney is a research associate at the UK-based human rights NGO, the Omega Research Foundation. He has over 20 years experience in research in military security and policy issues, with particular emphasis on the human rights impact of the manufacture, trade, and use of less lethal weapons and other law enforcement equipment. He has authored a number of papers and contributed to many reports by Amnesty International and other international and local NGOs. And he now contributes on these subjects to the work of the Human Rights Council, UNODC, OECHR, and the UN Special Procedures. He was a member of the academic working group that developed the 2020 United Nations Human Rights Guidance on less lethal weapons in law enforcement, and is currently chair of the UK National Taser Stakeholder Advisory Group. Neil, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to all the organizers of the event. I'm just going to share my screen for a couple of slides, if you'll bear with me while I pull those up. And hopefully that will work. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that Omega has undertaken on mapping excessive use of force under COVID. And this map can be found on our website. There's a very brief overview there. It's a worldwide mapping. It's not fully comprehensive, but we are updating it as we go along. And there's the link there that we'll share afterwards, but it's on our website. Overall, many different types of equipment were found, and we found that the enforcement of COVID-19 and the policing of protests and gatherings has been generally excessive. We've seen numerous examples in all parts of the world. And I'll come to the specific technologies in a moment. We started in March 2020 and will update into the future as well. I draw particular attention to the UN guidance that has been mentioned, the result of a 2-year process led by our dear friend and colleague, Christoph Heinz, who sadly passed away recently. And I urge all states and law enforcement agencies to consult the guidance and to use it in formulating human rights-based use of force models, which could enable better policing of protests. The largest concentration of the cases happened between March and June last year, 2020, when, for example, strict curfews were introduced and new measures were taken by law enforcement. People were struggling with access to food, travel, etc. But we do continue to see many cases, including individuals beaten or tear gassed by law enforcement officials for breaking curfews, or punishments for breaches of regulations such as not wearing a mask, social distancing rules, and particularly the policing of COVID-related anti-lockdown protests, political or social delivery protests. We've seen that law enforcement officials don't always need to use specialist equipment. The largest category type, in fact, is sort of open hand techniques, empty hand techniques, including beatings and those sort of things, and unlawful restraint holds. But specialist equipment is often used. Batons, tear gas, kinetic impact projectiles, and you see on the table here some of the types, but also things such as humiliation, where no weapon type is used. We included firearms just as a reference point because a lot of cases included firearms even though they weren't always fired, and beatings with rifle butts, etc., were quite typical. But on the equipment types, referring back to the guidance, section 4.1 and 2 of the guidance gives very useful detail on testing and assessing equipment. It emphasizes states should control the appropriate design, production, legal review, testing and procurement. That testing should be independent, not just focus on the medical implications, but include a wide range of expertise from the human rights, sociological and policing backgrounds. And it shouldn't just be about how the weapons are intended to be used, but should draw on experience from other jurisdictions about how weapons are used in other places. Openness and transparency mean that states should publish full technical parameters, any medical studies conducted, and the policies and procedures and guidelines for those weapons use. It can be used for defensive equipment and protective equipment, such as spit hoods, which have been introduced, and if they're fully tested, and also for other examples, such as high capacity tear gas launchers. We've suddenly seen those introduced in Colombia, for example, without any testing. They've led to injuries and one associated death, and their use has just recently been suspended by a judge pending testing and review, which should of course have happened before they were introduced. We've seen ad hoc and unauthorized weapons being used. A case in India where migrant workers were sprayed with a bleach solution, and many cases of beatings just using sticks, pieces of wood, handles, or, as I say, rifle butts. And the guidance notes that all equipment should be designed and produced to meet a legitimate law enforcement objective, not to be improvised. Training, of course, is absolutely crucial, And section 4.5 of the guidance has a lot to say on that. Officers should be trained in the lawful use of force, consistent with international human rights law and standards, but also on how to avoid the use of force using de-escalation, mediation, and communication. And they should be fully aware of those who are vulnerable or at risk. And they should only carry authorized weapons and those that they have been successfully trained in. So some examples of the equipment types we've seen, I've mentioned beatings. This is typical with police batons, one of the most widely used weapons worldwide. Using them to violently disperse crowds, or beating individuals and punishing individuals, or even particular holds around the neck, very dangerous holds, beating to the head. And this can be extremely serious, lead to serious injuries, and has resulted in deaths. Chemical irritants, tear gas and pepper sprays widely used, handheld sprays, hand-thrown or launched grenades and projectiles. And Clement mentioned that we've seen certainly many cases where they've been fired deliberately at people, contrary to any sort of safe regulation for their use. And we're seeing increasingly high capacity, long range tear gas launchers being used, and typically to disperse peaceful protests. And we've looked particularly at their use under COVID, and this is a particular concern. Obviously, coronavirus is spread chiefly by droplets, and any use of tear gas or irritants would cause more coughing, a clear risk, especially when people are closely confined in a crowd, perhaps, or may remove their masks because of the tear gas. And other bodies have emphasized this as well, the American Thoracic Society, and over 1,100 medical professionals, particularly noting it could increase the risk of COVID-19 by making the respiratory tract more susceptible to the infection, and of course inducing coughing. We've seen in at least 11 countries law enforcement widely using chemical irritants to enforce COVID restrictions. And the recommendation in the paper that we wrote specifically around this issue, which is on our website, would be that all use should be curtailed and strictly controlled. We've also seen and mapped inherently abusive equipment in use. For example, the use of electric shock batons by Kurdish security forces, attacks on journalists covering protests with electric shock batons, the use of kinetic impact ammunition, plastic and rubber bullets with multiple projectiles, widely used, for example, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, USA, leading to many deaths and serious injuries, blindings particularly. Cases in South Africa, for example, the double ball round, which is used there, and a death of an innocent bystander, a man who'd just come out of a shop when police were firing these on the streets. And these multiple projectiles causing particular problems. And the guidance states that any projectile of this nature should be able to impact efficiently and effectively on a small 10-centimeter area. So any multiple projectile inherently breaches the guidelines. We've seen some examples of the use of whips and other inherently abusive equipment which has no legitimate law enforcement purpose, particularly in South Africa, documented cases there on the streets of officers using those against people in queues, and then a man who was beaten in his own yard for having a drink. Whilst these number of cases is small, this is equipment that should not be used at all. And section 5 of the guidance very usefully lists such equipment, body-worn electric shock included, weighted restraints, etc. But that could be expanded and reviewed to make that list more comprehensive and cover the direct contact stun buttons, and other equipment. So just to round up, our work has certainly corroborated other groups' mapping of coronavirus restrictions, and in many countries, the pandemic's exacerbated the existing inequalities that there were already there, the marginalized, those most vulnerable in society who are experiencing already excessive discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. Some avenues for further avenues for reflection and consideration for action, needing a broad shift really in how use of force is viewed in order to respect the rights. We do need international standards, agreed, binding technical and performance standards for use of force, and also those for all uses of force, and reporting on such uses of force to be able to then assess how use of force and equipment, less lethal weapons, are used. The UN guidance already has within it the means to be updated, clarified and expanded. And as Christoph noted, it's by no means intended to be the last word. It's a starting point. And an important process that is being undertaken now, as well as the use of force and the use of weapons, the trade and their availability must be controlled. And we're working with the UN, with the EU, as well as NGOs and Amnesty International particularly, on the UN Secretary General's process, which hopefully will lead to a process on torture-free trade, developing international trade controls on law enforcement equipment. The mapping is ongoing, and anybody who needs an update can get in touch directly, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil, for your presentation and for guiding us a little bit through the content of the guidance document. I think that you're helping us to see how we can think about a human rights-based approach to law enforcement. And I just wanted to note that for those of you that are willing to take a look at the guidance, we have shared, the organizers have shared the link in which you can find the text in the chat box. With that, I would like now to give the floor to the third and final panelist. Her name is Luciana Paul. Luciana is an Argentine sociologist from the University of Buenos Aires. She is a senior fellow in security policy and human rights for CELS, the Center for Legal and Social Studies in Argentina. She's specialized as a researcher and coordinated the Institutional Violence and Public Safety Program, where she conducted field work on security policies, use of force, social protest and violence, women in prisons, and drug policies in Latin America. And currently she is working to the regional work for the same organization, coordinating an emergency legal assistance project in cases of protest in Latin America. Luciana, please, you have the floor.
Gracias, Embajadora. Thank you very much for organizing this. I am honored to speak here today in this such a timely event. I'm here representing the work made by many organizations who gathered years ago in the INCLO, International Civil Liberties Organizations Network. We are 15 organizations in 5 different continents. And the things that I will present today comes from our latest research on protesting during a pandemic. I remember at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, it was said that this crisis would affect every one of us and that the virus would not discriminate. But very quickly it became clear that this prediction was just not correct. The health crisis did not affect everyone in the same manner. Marginalized communities, racial minorities were overwhelmingly affected by COVID-19. These communities have been severely impacted by lockdowns and the restrictions to work, to find food, and registered disproportionately high numbers of deaths. It might not be a coincidence that the biggest protests against racism in decades arose in the middle of the pandemic. Next, please. The organizations who work with and provide support to social movements and protesters in different latitudes were on alert since the beginning of the pandemic. Certainly was the case of the INCLO network organizations. Severe situations of inequality and massive protest were already happening in many countries when the pandemic started. Remember Chile and Hong Kong in 2019. Adding to that, the pandemic further exacerbated and crystallized existing inequalities, which in turn contributed to the eruption of more protests. If we analyze state responses in general terms, we can say that we saw the exacerbation of previous tendencies in each country. So in some cases, it was the concentration of power, the targeting of dissidents, as seen, for instance, in Hungary, in Russia. In other cases, it was a criminalization of certain groups, as the case of Black Lives Matter. We had over 17,000 protesters arrested in the US only in the first 2 weeks following the murder of George Floyd. And in other cases, it was the illegal use of force by law enforcement, the focus of our attention today. This happened, including in the most unexpected and I would say unacceptable situations during the time of lockdowns, as it was the forced evictions of thousands of families in the time where we were all supposed to stay at home, precisely. And this happened in Kenya, happened in Argentina, happened in Colombia and South Africa. Next slide, please. The violent responses by law enforcement and also by military personnel was one of the most visible forms of abuse of force during the pandemic. Overall, seeing cases from different continents, we have identified 3 tendencies, and they are consistent with the findings of our special rapporteur and the findings that Omega just presented as well. So the first trend is that these policing practices have disproportionately targeted members of racial minorities and other marginalized communities. It was cited previously the example of the migrant workers in India being retained, beaten, and sprayed by the police at the border, just preventing them to travel back home. The second trend is that in many instances, the use of particular police weapons or tactics, including tear gas and pepper spray, have increased the risk of COVID transmission instead of reducing it in the moment of protest. Public health experts caution about these risks associated with provoking stampedes or provoking the crowdings of people that are coughing, that are gasping for air, as we've seen in instances in Kenya and Indonesia during the police repressions of protest. And also the very inappropriate use of kettling in these times, seen in Israel, for instance, during the Balfour demonstrations, where there were the presence of children and elderly people among the protesters. Next, please. The disproportionate use of force by law enforcement during the pandemic has also been a sign of a broader phenomenon pointed out by the special rapporteur just now. So our third take, the third tendency we identify is the militarization of domestic security. over 70,000 military troops were deployed to enforce the lockdown in South Africa. Several deaths were caused by military and police, showing the brutality against Black South Africans. And we remember the arrival of thousands of National Guard troops in combat gear to Portland in the US and the escalated tensions that it brought. So the seriousness and exceptional nature of the COVID-19 crisis have been used to normalize security practices that can have long-term effects on civil and human rights. This is something that we are definitely monitoring from INCLO. What will be the legacy of the pandemic in the practices of law enforcement and even in terms of legal frames in relation to protest rights? Next, please. Colombia was one of the cases of extended social unrest that is still ongoing in the country, leaving hundreds of people dead and injured. The army was deployed. Indigenous peoples in Cali, for instance, were particularly attacked. Armed civilians were operating. And we have seen a very weak response from the Attorney General, La Defensoría, and other control agencies. So in Colombia and beyond, we conclude that rather than rendering the government COVID response more effective, the use of military and militarized responses during the pandemic has reinforced long-held mistrust in the state and security forces, especially as enforcement has been inconsistent. Next, please. At INCLO Network, we have surveyed the responses from civil society as well to these trends. That has been very rich. Legal actions in different countries, some of them that had successful court rulings stopping the militarized practice, some direct emergency support to social movements, some people incarcerating for protesting, as CELS is doing in Latin America now, advocacy actions, negotiations with authorities, public engagement of different sorts. I invite you to take a look to our research that was just published. Next, please. It compiles cases from 14 different countries in 5 continents where these different trends were observed and where our INCLO members are based. Next, please. So this is, the result is this protesting during a pandemic, which was a fascinating collaborative work in our network. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the exchanges during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Luciana, for sharing with us the work of CELS and also sharing the learnings and the findings on the disproportionate impact of the use of force during peaceful process for the most marginalized groups. I think that is quite important. I also want to note that Neil has shared with us a little bit more of detailed information on weapons and equipment, and he has shared with us a guide that you can upload in the, download in the links that have been shared with us in the box and the chat box. I want to now look back at my at the incredible support of Felix from the Geneva Academy to learn if we have some questions for the panelists. Felix, if you can let me know if we have received any question for the panelists so far.
Thank you very much, Catalina. And indeed, the chat is rather quiet at the moment. So please, I'm inviting everybody to use the chat to insert your comments and questions, or do also send things bilaterally as someone has. And actually, there is a question generally framed, but I might want to give it, or you might want to give it also to Clément and Luciana. So actually, It was about the positive sides too, and actually it was noted that it was interesting that you both also speak about positive sides. I think Luciana, with the legacy of COVID and civil society action to protect again the right to protest, because whenever we hear about negative or basically of legacy of COVID, it's rather the negative sides of what emergency measures will quietly move into the new normal. So whether you'd like to say some more words on this, and actually Clément, for him it was relating to his mention, Clément, of the fact that states need to notify the Secretary General when suspending covenant rights, and whether you would know actually whether many states have done so, so whether there was at least positive respect of that obligation to notify, so whether there is any statistics on those. And so while I hand over those to you, I'll just keep looking to the chat and the emails, whether something else is coming in, and I'll be back with you soon. Thank you, Catalina.
Thank you very much, Felix and the Geneva Academy. I don't know, Luciana, Clément, if you want to take the floor again to try to address the question that was presented by Felix. Clément?
Thank you very much, Felix. And yes, I'm not sure if I understood well the first question, which if I understood well, talk about the positive side of the measure taken during the COVID-19 by states, right? Well, I think what I was saying is that while we noticed that in many jurisdictions, COVID-19 was used as pretext to repress peaceful protests, we also saw that in many countries also use human rights approach in handling. I mean, we have to be fair and say that we saw many governments that the first thing that they did was to consult with civil society, to consult with community, to also ensure that any measure that is taken to mitigate the impact of COVID, taking account also a measure put in place to ensure that communities are able also to continue to have the minimum to live. We saw that in a country that in most of them have in place already some of the mechanism to consult with civil society also, but the mechanism also to mitigate such crisis. It's true. Let's also say that the crisis was not unforeseen by many countries, but the good thing that I noticed in my I was referring to is that at the same time where there is a crackdown in many countries, we saw that in other countries there is more discussion, there is more participation from civil society, there's more participation on minorities or marginalized group. One of the examples being also that in some countries the lockdown was not declared just like this, but it was declared after the government put in place some measure to ensure that communities are able also to have to continue their livelihood, to have the minimum to survive. And we saw also that in some of those countries, the violence but also the respect to the measure declared by the governments was followed quite well in some of these. Another aspect, when I mentioned about the need for country when they declare state emergency to notify the Secretary General, this is what the convention, the ICCP have as a provision. But I remember when we monitored that in the middle of the COVID-19, if I can have the figures in the country, we know that many countries did not mention or did not officially inform the Secretary General. We saw more de facto emergency or de facto state of emergency, which means that measure taken look as as the measure described under the state of emergency, but at the same time, because there was no notification, formal notification to the Secretary General, we classify them as a de facto state of emergency because they was not declared to the Secretary General. Yeah, this is what I can see, but I don't have the figures in mind now, but we know that in many countries there was no declaration that you can help us now to say that how many states declare until now.
Thank you very much, Clement. I would also like to have Luciana and Neil. I would also like to see if you have something to add to this first question. I understand that we have another question, but first let's hear from Luciana and then from Neil. And perhaps to also remind all of the participants that you can raise your hand using the raise hand function in the Zoom platform in case you want to make your question live. You can also use, of course, the chat box, but in case you want to do it using the hand raise, you can also do it like that. And perhaps, Luciana, have we seen any state also, if I may add, correcting their interventions after first failure, for instance? I mean, not only seeing good practices from the beginning, but is there, correction of states' measures after the first or their initial response that might not have been adequate? Luciana.
For the difficult question. I think that we have definitely seen the impact of some actions by communities, by the union of different social groups, social movements, civil society in general, human rights organizations, unions, community organizations helping out locally. I think that we have seen an interesting cooperations in certain moments with local authorities with the aims of one of the principles that Neil was referring are present in the guidelines, and I hope we would see it more in the spirit of the state responses, is that the de-escalation should be the logic that moves the state responses. There were also moments in where protesters really tried to accommodate the health restrictions to express even very hard circumstances they were in. Let's remember at the beginning in Colombia, there were the red handkerchief tied in the windows of houses, indicating that those houses were in lockdown, but were struggling to make ends meet, to find necessary things to go through the lockdown at the family level. So there were these ways of trying to express these extreme circumstances in a cautious way. Also, let's recognize that for states were very complex situations, because we expressed today cases in there were very desperate demands, but in many countries we had also these other groups that were not protesting their grievances, but just to oppose any way of health restrictions and to demand to go back to business as usual, no matter the human costs, and refusing to comply with any basic social distancing, etc. So states had to deal with that as well at the same time. I think that one of the maybe challenges is that the responses of the states were so uneven in different cases. So that is one of the things that I think gathered this social response, that it was so strong. And I think the anti-racism movement that we have seen in the last year talks a lot about that, about the uneven implementation, even of an enforcement that should be completely equal for anyone as a health restrictions. So I definitely think that there were positive things coming from the union and collaboration of different social groups in these circumstances, and some state reactions as well.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Neil, do you want to add anything?
Just very briefly to agree with the sort of collaborations, civil society collaborations, and also collaborations with UN bodies, monitoring bodies, etc., have been very strong and strengthened, I think, through the pandemic. There have been some positive practices, the sort of remote monitoring of policing or law enforcement more generally, including prisons and places of detention, some of which has been developed over the last year. There's I think an increased awareness for and maybe sort of increased energy for new policing methods to be brought in. So things like the defund the police movement in the USA, which is now spreading more widely. Whilst people may sort of have questions about that, you know, that whole concept, the examination of how funds are spent, on what they are spent, and what that means on the streets for policing on the streets is really important. We certainly have seen some flexible policing responses and some acceptance by police in various states that their perhaps initial over policing of protests or any sort of gathering at all in the initial stages of the pandemic and the restrictions brought in had to be more flexible and had to allow people that space. In some cases, not all. So yes, I think that some small positives.
Well, that brings us a little bit of hope, and I think this is also a learning process for those that have genuine intentions of doing things right. I want to go back to the Geneva Academy. Felix, I understand that there is another question. If you can help me with that one, please.
Yes, indeed, very much so. Thank you, Catalina. And I see that now also people start requesting the floor to speak themselves. So I will just read out 2 questions to you that we received via the chat. And then I see Bonanza Tayitu requested for the floor. So that's then maybe the next one. But so let me just read out first those questions. One colleague asked, saying that she's interested to hear about the gendered aspects of the use of force during peaceful protest in the context of COVID-19. So here the question on the gender aspects and about the violence and the policing. We have another question which looks actually also interestingly, I think, in that continuum of reinforcing or aggravating situations versus new issues. So the participant states in her opinion that failures in accountability and disciplinary processes has been long-standing in South Africa and further manifested during the implementation of the lockdowns. So it's that aggravating issue. But then the question is, are there examples in any country where failures of accountability and of the unlawful use of force were not part of previous patterns, so new things that emerged actually just during the pandemic? So those were 2 questions directed, I think, to anyone in the panel. And then I don't know if you want to include right now already in that round the request from the colleague who is requesting for the floor to speak herself.
Yes, I think it would be good to have 3 questions together. If we can have the person that wants to speak taking the floor now. Do you have the name, Felix?
Yes, Bonanza P. Tayitu, and you can, yes, sorry, you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Felix. Excellencies, my name is Bonanza from Indonesian Mission here. Thank you very much for the permanent missions of Swiss and Costa Rica for organizing this meeting, and also Geneva Human Rights Platform. We thank the panelists for the presentations, Clemens, Nels, and Luciana. Interesting study conducted by your network, Luciana, and I see that one of Indonesian NGO Contrast contributed to your study, and I look forward for having a deeper discussions on that, because this is indeed an important questions at the moment to safeguard the peaceful protests as well as to safeguard the public health interest in the broader scale. Now, I fully concur with Neil's observations on the importance of educations and having a guidelines. But I would like also to seek your further views on the role of police commissions or ombudsman or National Human Rights Commission in partnering with the police to safeguard these peaceful protests or the rights or freedoms, for them to be able to be manifested in this kind of difficult situations, bearing in mind, of course, the guidance of the public health protocol. And second, Clement, thank you very much for your observations on the consultative mechanism that you highlighted in your interventions. And I'm wondering on the role of media to have a check and balances in this response, because I believe in more free society with media, robust media, I believe there are a lot of check balances could be occurring vis-a-vis the response of the police to this peaceful protest. And I believe the police also has this scale of response to the protest when it comes, when it started peacefully, but then it ended up with unpeaceful manner. And that linked to the Luciana research. If I'm not mistaken, the contrast highlighted the use of tear gas, which is also part of the procedures in some cases, as well as I don't know, the research stated that the police attack ambulance. To my knowledge, I don't know whether it is real ambulance or not, because in some instances, the ambulance that they claim contains rocks and other unpeaceful instrument of demonstrations that create, of course, a legitimate reasons for the police to do their utmost important to safeguard the interest of the public. And look forward for having further discussions in this. And this is indeed very important discussions, and we would like to again thanks the permanent mission of Switzerland and Costa Rica for bringing up this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manansa, from the permanent mission of Indonesia for your question. And then I want to go back to the panel unless we have another question. I think that we can leave it for the final round. Right now we have 3 questions for you. One on the gender aspects of the responses, if there are any considerations on that regard. Second one, is there any let's say new issues instead of structural issues to the failure of holding accountable those that are using the force in an appropriate way. So it has the pandemic brought, I think, any new issues that have not been considered previously. And then 2 questions I understand on the role of the NHRIs and the role of media when it comes to this. I will start with Luciana, followed by Neil, and then closing with Clement. Luciana, please.
Thank you. I'll try to refer briefly to the questions. On the gender aspects, yes, we definitely have been seeing that, and it is a concern. It has been an issue in Colombia where around 40 claims of sexual abuse to protesters have been filed recently. It has been seen in Peru in the demonstrations at the end of last year in November. It has been a problem in Chile as well. I'm talking about Latin American region, but it definitely raised a concern, and I think we should devote a little more attention on what are the safeguards that could be in place to allow for women full enjoyment of the rights of assembly. Because if to add to all the things that we heard today in terms of use of force, use of weapons, different violent tactics, and all the risks that many people run when they go to a demonstration, women on top of that are facing a real risk of being sexually abused while being detained, after being detained, etc. in a protest. I think it's definitely a concern. And there has been some experiences also on Women's March on how to police those kind of marches, what would be the role of feminine personnel, etc., etc. So I think there is a lot there to work in the future. In terms of the lack of accountability, yes, it is a very complex topic, but definitely the states of emergencies and the uses of the states of emergency restricts the visibility of some of the processes. In many cases allow for the intervention of armed forces. That brings a whole set of accountability restrictions because the use of military justice. So we definitely have seen that in the COVID associated with the use of states of emergency and associated with historical lack of independent oversight to the police. And I link this to the question of that kindly that the representative of Indonesia has raised. I think it is a very important role. And we have seen, for instance, the very active reaction of the Instituto Nacional de Derechos Humanos in Chile back then in 2019, documenting and acting to report human rights violation. And we see now in Colombia this very weak response from the agencies of control. And it is definitely makes a difference when we have strong control agencies. We believe that it is possible, of course, to work with the police, but the accountability mechanisms should be external. And I will stop here, so I leave more time to the other panelists, and thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Neil, please.
Thank you very much. Just on the gendered aspects of use of force. So we have seen, firstly, I should say the data is very hard to gather generally in the way that we've gathered data without on the ground reporting from civil society partners, which is not possible in every country that we've covered. So we've used media reports, UN reports, a wide range of UN human rights body reports and that sort of thing to collate the mapping, as well as civil society reporting. So we've seen sex workers targeted, particularly under COVID and policing restrictions. We've seen informal traders in the informal economy have been targeted, particularly because they're on the streets trading, not in shops and places like that. And when restrictions were put in place in a number of states, people were cleared from the streets, and a lot of the informal traders in certain places were women who were targeted. We have seen trans women targeted when there were restrictions perhaps on movement or shopping and that sort of thing based on days of the week and gender, and where perhaps the gender didn't match government ID cards that had been sort of put out. So that was one of the specific issues we saw. And we've also seen reported and some research going on the gendered health effects of particularly the use of chemical irritants, tear gas, and the effects, the gendered effects that there may be, which have been vastly under-researched in the past. And there's very little in the established sort of medical journals and that type of thing. But one particular piece of research there, Planned Parenthood in the USA, responding to the the social protests of the Black Lives Matter movement, has done a lot of outreach to protesters to try and gather some data on those gendered effects. I can't add anything on the second question, the new sort of emerging sort of issues, perhaps, yeah, just agreeing that the sort of use of armed forces and the oversight there, and how armed forces are obviously trained in a very different way from policing and the use of force within policing. So that being a particular issue. And then to from Indonesia, and the role of NHRIs, ombudspersons and commissions, I think is a very important role. And Luciana mentioned that in safeguarding the rights, where those bodies are very effective, when they have true independence from any sort of government or political interference, where they're funded and their funding is secure and their role is guaranteed in law, I think then when they're fully independent, they can have a crucial role in promoting, protecting the rights for peaceful protest and in the monitoring of those, where other bodies, you know, don't exist perhaps. So yeah, I'll pass over to Clément.
Thank you, Neil. Clément?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think on the gender aspects, from my experience, based on the cases that we received from April 2020 until April 2021, most of the cases was more women issue. You can also see this from our communication reporting, where you can see that there is increase in terms of cases of protest or harassment or violation of the right to peaceful assembly or association. Most of them, when we base our research on individual, is women. This probably is due, it's because women are more affected by the COVID-19, and most of the protests we saw increased number of the women joining the protests compared to the previous year. Probably because of the impact that is disproportionately felt by the women, but also the fact also that the police law enforcement do not really distinguish if it's a woman or man. And this is an increased worry, you know. Another thing that I want also to maybe comment on that is the issue of accountability. I think the question of accountability during, in particular, for the law enforcement during this COVID pandemic is also the nature of the decree that declares state of emergency. We saw that in many cases, some of those decrees do not put any limits. I mean, because there was many governments were surprised, and some of them, like I mentioned, that because they think COVID-19 is an opportunity, it gives law enforcement a blank issue to repress. And we also saw that through the violence, some of the time the violence of the repression. And add to that, we know that is also COVID-19 was the time when you don't have monitor of protests on ground. And law enforcement, because there is no monitor on the ground, they are empowered to repress, because we know that in many cases where you have, for example, a monitor on the ground, you have law enforcement, you have other mechanisms that are there to monitor the protests, law enforcement refrain from repressing. So we saw that there was increase in the repression, but also there was quite violent in repression, because there was no, those monitors, because of the COVID-19, they were not granted permits to monitor the protests. And then the third one is also that many courts closed. So those who are either because they request permit to protest, or they inform the police to protest, and police do not accept, they don't have the possibility even to have appeal mechanism because some of the courts were closed at that time, or the process are too long because of the COVID-19. Some courts meet online, and it's not the same speed like we used to have. So I think some of those things also empower law enforcement in the way that they use force against the protests on the ground. And this is why it's important really to ensure that courts resume their work, that some of the mechanisms put in place resume their work. When I'm talking about consultation process, because I remind this in many states, I think this is the time, the time of the crisis is the time where states need to show his willingness to really consult with population, to consult with community, because the participation is more important than repression. Because when people feel like they participate, they are also consulted on the measure to put in place, because at the end, it's their own health. It's their own health. So when they are consulted, when they understand this measure, they are willing to accept them. But if they are not consulted, they don't know when the curfew will start, when it will be the end, and what is put in place to ensure that they can go to the market, they can shop. They will not accept those kind of measures that lock them in their room and with empty stomach. I think this is why I always call for consultation. And the last thing that I want also to show is the National Human Rights Institution. Somebody talk about the role. I remember in the middle of the crisis when I was looking for best examples from the National Human Rights Institution in contributing or helping the states to put in place best consultation process or best on how the state can manage some of the assembly. The only example I saw at that time was the National Human Rights Institution from Ethiopia, where, for example, they were able to translate to comments or to make a fact sheet that show the law enforcement that emergency situation should not allow you to do so. You have to remember that the Constitution provides this fundamental right, that if you go beyond this, you will be punished and your responsibility will be engaged. And for me, that was also a good example at that time to sensitize them. But now the question is in practice, if the law enforcement follows those things. That's the big question that need to be asked. Because I think if I can end there, the delegate from Indonesia also talk about media, and I'm sure you are talking about disinformation around the COVID-19. I think let's also be honest that at the beginning of the COVID-19, only states have the information. That was the problem. And the states have the information, the state was on control of the information. And states is the only one that say what is going on, what are the measures. And when the media started bringing other information, bringing some of the lights on some of these measures, many states was not happy. And we saw what happened as a repression on that against journalists and everything. And I think that the problem if you talk about the media, the role of them, the big problem is the states ready to provide information to the media in order for the media to do their work as a media in a democratic society. That's the problem. And I saw that in many cases, many authorities do not want to provide information. A number of the cases to the media, what is the measure that are putting in place, how many person was injured during this. So then you end by having media also trying to find information where they can find it and put it in public place. So thank you very much. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Clement. And we are, I see that the Geneva Human Rights Platform is sharing more information with us in the chat box. I understand that there is no further questions. Felix, could you confirm? Because I have none.
Indeed, there was somebody requesting for the floor, but no, unfortunately, the person dropped out of the meeting. I don't know if for technical or schedule reasons, but so unless it was Imdadul Hake, unless you're still in the meeting, but I didn't find you anymore in the list of participants. So if you would like to take the floor, please do raise your hand again because that dropped. But indeed, I don't see the person anymore in the meeting, which means no, we are at the end of the list of questions that I had collected, Catalina.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you to the panelists for this very informative and I think very useful discussion that we had today that has bring a lot of tools and analysis of how we can move forward in this situation and this context with the COVID. I have just one, and I would like to have you doing closing remarks very briefly before I close the meeting. I wanted to reflect on the work of the Human Rights Council. We are now in the middle of the session. We are thinking, of course, and you've mentioned different tools. We have the resolution. How do you think that this resolution can be used? Is it useful? Is it something that can be done better? I mean, you may have several delegations attending this event. So what would be expected from you in terms of what would be helpful to a special procedure, to an NGO from such a resolution? And I will be, and if you have any further remarks, but now I will ask you to be very brief because we have 1.5 minutes, and it will be time as in the Human Rights Council session. We will disconnect you after the 1 minute 30. So please, perhaps I can start with Neil.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Yeah, I think the series of resolutions has been extremely useful to give a setting and to take forward the existing human rights and policing standards. So the joint report, the UN guidance, those types of things that came out of it. I think there's still a need to go further, and I particularly think the need is around developing from the guidance more technical and performance standards for police weapons. You know, why is it that police are still using obsolete, dangerous, highly risky weapons in a lot of cases, or they're using, you know, they're really misusing them in a way that is creating injuries, you know, long-term disabling of protesters in the hundreds, if not thousands, across the world. And that's something that really needs to be tackled. And I think there's scope for that, and I think there's an appetite that both within the UN system and within policing, progressive policing organizations, which maybe aren't so well represented in some of the Human Rights Council sessions, but we meet as an NGO, they are open to some of that as well. They realize that policing doesn't always get it right. I'll finish there and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Neil. Luciana, please.
Thank you. Very briefly, a couple of points. I think there are a lot to do in the implementation of all these resolutions. There is also, I think, the connection of different agendas at the Human Rights Council. Now in this session, we are going to continue debating on the resolution 43/1 on structural racism and police brutality. I think it is necessary to start connecting these agendas. Also, it is very important the role of the studies that the Office of the High Commissioner in connection with the resolutions of the Council could perform, and including, I'm thinking of maybe case analysis that leads us to the investigation of specific points that are already identified as problematic areas. One discussed extensively today was the militarization and the relations between states of emergency, militarization, and lack of accountability. That is an area I think that it could be further develop some standards for next emergencies. Also, I'm thinking about case studies on problematic police practices, and the targeting the eyes of the protesters, I think, has reached a limit, and it could be developed some police accountability that are conducted specifically to target that practice that has left hundreds of people blind already. So with the things that we already know, we could advance in the work, the local work, the regional office of the High Commission, the NRIs at each national level, etc., to advance the work in these specific areas. And lastly, just a very brief mention to something that Neil raised up, that is this market of less lethal weapons or crowd control weapons. That market needs to be further standardized and controlled. We cannot be producing things that are potentially lethal to use in protests.
Thank you very much, Clement. Your final remarks, please.
Thank you very much. I think resolutions are really important. I just wanted also to highlight that the special procedure did quite a lot during this crisis. And if you go to the special procedure websites, you can see the amount of the work that we put there, reminding states of their obligation during this COVID-19. I just also wanted to also mention that in July 2020, I mentioned that in my speech, the Human Rights Council gave me the mandate to look at the protection of human rights during peaceful protests in crisis situations, such as COVID-19, and request to me to organize consultation at the regional level in Africa, Latin America, Asia, all with law enforcement, but also all stakeholder states, to come up with some concrete best practice on how the human rights can be protected during this crisis time when it comes to the protests. I think it's important for me. One way for us to build better, to build back better, is to learn from what our mistake from this time, COVID-19, because COVID-19 shows us, and I want to mention that it's not only repressive regime, even democratic regime failed to protect the fundamental freedom during this COVID-19. So we have to learn from that, and we need also to be prepared for the future crisis, because as many experts are saying, this is not the end. This is probably the beginning. So our democracy can only survive if we are able to learn from what happened this time and to be prepared to ensure that whenever we deal with this type of crisis, consultation, participation is important, is put forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clement. And with that, we come to the end of our event. I want to start by thanking the Geneva Human Rights Platform and the Geneva Academy for their support, and of course the partnership with the government and the Permanent Mission of Switzerland, for Costa Rica, and for our permanent mission. It's always a great opportunity. We're truly committed to this initiative on protecting human rights, and specifically protecting the right of peaceful protest. We have discussed so many things today on how this right has been limited in the context of the COVID pandemic. And I think that from what we have heard, of course, we've the panelists, which I also want to thank very much for their participation and their input, have present to us how the situation has been evident, the failures of our systems when it comes to marginalized groups, when it comes to both countries that are more democratic and countries that are less democratic, the challenges we have with the equipment and the use of force that might be considered legal, but how do we use it in a way that is actually used in a human rights-based approach, that we use or have the law enforcement used in a way that will be in full accordance with international law, and that will be effective to the means that it serves. Because I hear many of you saying how this law enforcement is not only, of course, limiting fundamental rights, but sometimes even contradicting the mere fact or the mere idea of or objective of the lockdown, of the emergency measures, making easier or facilitating the risk of COVID transmission, for instance. But we're learning that we have, I believe, a structural failure, and that we need to have stronger institutions, further consultation, that we need to have more technical capacity, we need to have cooperation. We need to have further development of tools that will and guidance that will help us to respond in a better way, that we need to look at intersectional approaches, because I think that it was quite interesting to hear about the challenges when it came to the gender aspect of it, how we need more data on the impact and the differentiate impact when it comes to different groups, and specifically, for instance, women or communities as the trans community. So this is a multifactorial discussion that we need to have. We have some tools, some of them have been shared that, but we need further development. And I hope that this discussion and the discussions that we have and we could have at the Human Rights Council will help us to advance. Again, thank you very much for your participation, to the panelists, to the Geneva Academy, to the Swiss Mission. For Costa Rica has been an honor helping and hosting this event. Thank you very much.